Hi there! Welcome to Witchcraft Fundamentals Lesson 5, Local and Personal Correspondence. In our last lesson, we talked about traditional tables of correspondence in terms of spell components, things like colors and elements and herbs and stones, and the definitions of those things you're going to find in all the books. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to personalize all of that. Because book definitions are well and good, and they're an amazing place to start your journey and your exploration of correspondences. But the strongest and most potent spell components are going to be things that have meaning for you. So when you're choosing what kind of components to use in your magic, instead of worrying about finding the exact things that are in the book, things that are correct, things that other people tell you you're supposed to use, it's more important to use things that are resonating with you. There's three main things to look at when you're looking to find a personal correspondence. You're looking at local ingredients, how they resonate with your spirits and allies, and things that have personal meaning or resonance for you. In general, we're looking at substitutions a lot. So, say you're looking through one of the spell cookbooks, something like the Element Encyclopedia of 5,000 Spells. Or maybe you've got one of the old grimoires, or, some neat spell you found on TikTok. And maybe it uses ingredients you're not 100% sure what they are, because we spooky people love our spooky names for things. Part of that is historical, where people had to hide what they were doing, and so they gave them funny names. And part of it is barrier to entry, where you have to know the guy to know what his weird funny names actually mean. It's proof that you got the information through a valid source. Of course, over the years, everything was been stolen from everyone, and so we have forgotten what most of these things mean. Not super helpful when trying to do magic. But so sometimes spells call for things that maybe they're super expensive. I had one particular spell, it's like, and you must use tincture of gold. And I'm like, no. Essence of saffron. Also, no. Some things are hard to find. You might find older spells might call for ambergris, which is illegal because those wells are endangered now. For people using things like ambergris in perfume. And sometimes there are things that are energetically incompatible with either you or the target. Maybe you're vegan, and the spell's like, and you must pierce a cow tongue with nails. That perhaps is not the spell for you. Can't quite just do the same thing with cabbage. But, sometimes there's going to be spell components that are just not going to work for you. Maybe it's, create an oil and with red hot peppers and rub it on a thing, and maybe you're highly allergic to capsicums, and so perhaps handling them is not your best choice. You're going to find a substitution. Now, this is where all the work you did in the last lesson is going to come real handy, because the first thing you need to do when you're doing a substitution is find out what the correspondences are for all of those components in the tradition in which the spell was written. So if you're looking at a spell that purports to be from some dude in the Isle of Man in 1775, well, you're going to look at the correspondences of people at that time were using, people from those traditions, and you're going to figure out what all the different components mean. This thing is for luck, this thing is a spell enhancer, this thing is a stabilizer, this thing is, whatever. And those things, you can now find other things that have the correct correspondence and substitute the thing that is illegal, unethical, impossible to get a hold of, weird, doesn't work for you kind of stuff with things that do work for you. Sounds too easy, I know, but that's how that actually works. Any spell that you're reading from a book or on the internet is something that at some point was convenient for the person who was doing it, had meaning for the person who was doing it, had resonance, maybe they had their spirit guide said that they must go upon this quest of 21 nights under the dark of the moon, blah, 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 blah. Very Hobbit-like questy thing. Maybe that quest is part of the spell. It's possible. Uh, but you have to look at that kind of context and see what that then translates to in your context. I am not a 14th century agrarian. I work in IT. I live in the suburbs. I don't have a scythe. I do have a machete. But I don't have a scythe. I do have kitchen knives, and I do have, mortar and pestle. I do have that. But I got rhododendrons and cedar trees and roses and Himalayan blackberry and ivy. So much ivy. Ferns, Oregon grape, etc. The things that grow here are what's available to me easily. And as someone who walks the land, as a practitioner, I go and I get to know the plants around me. I get to know the spirits around me. And so if I need to do a spell, I'm going to find the correspondences of the things that are around me, that have an energetic connection to me, spirits that I have a relationship to. I'm going to ask their permission first, because I'm not a dick. And then if they agree to help me out, I will harvest a bit of plant or a rock or a piece of dirt or a twig or whatever. And that's what I'll use as my spell components. I don't necessarily need some far-flung, hard-to-find, super expensive, rarefied, ooky spooky, Hydron the Conqueror root all the time. There's special occasions, of course. But for the most part, if something in a spell doesn't work for you, you can substitute something that does work for you. Now, you can't always make substitutions. There are some spells where that is not actually appropriate. Basically, if you ever have your gut instinct says, no, you have to do that exactly as written, there's something about the process of the ordeal to get all of these things, to do all of these very specific tasks and timings and, things to create this spell, well, then that's probably what you need to do. There is energy that is imparted into a greater working when it's a bit of an ordeal to make it happen. But that's a very specific type of energy, and that isn't always the case. In fact, it's often not the case. Most of the everyday kind of things that you do, spell to make sure you get to work on time, spell to make sure your immune system is strong, spell to make sure you make it that extra 20 miles to that gas station that you forgot to fill up before. Little everyday things, you can do whatever you need with whatever you got. There's also times where if you're working with spirit allies, things like deities, ancestors, land spirits, they might have very specific instructions, and you cannot deviate from them. When I work with Baron Samedi, I must get him 3, not 1, not 2, but 3 cigars of roughly $10 a piece as my offering to him. That is the agreement we have. That is the agreement we shall keep. If I cannot do that, I need to have a really good reason. Because that's the promise I made. When you make a promise to a metaphysical entity, you need to keep it. You really, really need to keep it. But that's kind of it a lot of the time. The other thing to be really careful with if you're doing a substitution and a spell is cultural context. Particularly if you're looking at any type of indigenous magic, if you're looking at any of the diaspora traditions, things that are, maybe a little bit spookier or outside of your wheelhouse, there are traditions that have very specific cultural context around certain ingredients. Look at, say, Haitian voodoo. It is very common in Haitian voodoo to have your big, major working. The entire village comes, and in the process, a goat is slaughtered. And I'm not saying that you need to go out and slaughter a goat. I'm really not. But there is a cultural context around that. These animals are raised in a particular way, in a sacred way. They are tended to in a sacred way. They are slaughtered in a sacred way. They are then consumed in an incredibly mindful and sacred way. And there's a vast amount of context for that. You can't just willy-nilly substitute for something with that kind of context. In a case like that, unless you are in a group that is part of that tradition, perhaps you might look at an alternative ritual. I mean, is that really what you need to be doing? But I don't know you or your context, so no judgment. But if you're looking at something, what's a good example? Okay, so in Curanderismo, we do a lot of things. Some practitioners will do a lot of things with, say, animal feathers or feather fans. And I've known practitioners that will have a whole wing of a bird and use it as a fan for barridas, which is a sweeping cleansing practice. And for some practitioners here in the United States or elsewhere, the idea of using an animal part in their practice might be absolutely horrifying to them. In which case, find an alternative practice. There's a lot of other things. Do it with herbs. It's fine. But say, there's a specific meaning to doing a sweeping cleansing with crow feathers, with an eagle feather, with turkey feathers, with pheasant feathers. You're going to have to find something else that has that energy, that correspondence, to substitute, rather than using the thing that might offend you. Just, like I said, keep in mind that cultural context and don't judge another tradition because you're not in their shoes. Just be cool. Everybody just be cool. That actually segues nicely into unethical components. Now, if you look at some of the old European grimoires, they were written by medieval edgelords. There was this vast tradition of court magicians who had to look impressive to their patrons. And so they had the ookiest and spookiest of things because then the lords are getting their money's worth. So they have explosions and smoke and, dead birds and cats and things and things to look impressive that don't actually enhance the magic. In that case, we substitute. First, we check the working. Is this an edgelord putting on a pantomime, or is this an actual magical working? There are plenty of those too. Use your judgment. But if there's, unethical components, things like ambergris is a really common spell component you find in Victorian magic because it was a common perfume ingredient at the time. It was expensive, but it was something you could get a hold of, which nowadays is fantastically not cool. If you're not an indigenous person in the United States, you are not allowed to own eagle feathers because they're not for us. Endangered plants we're not allowed to go out and pick and burn because some old book told us that it's magic. That's not cool either. Think about rhino horn poaching that is still used in black market Chinese medicine. We think that's bad, right? Maybe don't use the endangered sage. Sometimes you'll find old spell components that are things like, and trespass to the house of your loved one and steal their underwear and use it in your spell. Perhaps, perhaps don't trespass or burglarize someone. Just a thought. Don't commit crime. Uh, in those cases, if you still want to really do something that is based on that spell, you're going to have to shift things about and substitute them a little bit. You always can, unless you've got some like compelling metaphysical reason not to do a substitution for something that is otherwise maybe not in your best interest to do. Just do it differently. All you're trying to do is get from point A to point B. There's a whole world of possibilities of how to get from point A to point B. Don't fixate on just one of them. So yeah, just be aware. You don't have to do things that are just spooky and sound like something in a horror movie, because that's more authentic. It's not. Actual witchcraft is about what you've got and making the best out of it. It's not about looking like you stepped out of a horror movie set. Though sometimes that's a lot of fun, but that's a different thing. Localization. Localization is one of the most important things you can do to really strengthen your magic. A lot of the stuff that we're going to find in books, a lot of it is based on British tradition. If you're looking at sources in English, particularly here in the United States, most of the things are coming from British traditions and inspirations, unless it specifically says otherwise. And as you might have noticed, the United States is not Britain. We have different plants and different animals and climates and various and sundry things. It's different. So why would you use the wild heather of Scotland when you can use the, the wild cedar of your next door neighbor? I live in the Pacific Northwest. We have cedar, we've got salal, we've got Oregon grape, we've got sword ferns, every kind of moss and lichen you could possibly imagine. There's grass and wild plantain and heelal, and all Scotch broom is now invasive here. But there's all kinds of things that are indigenous, native to specific locations. And plants that are indigenous to a location have a stronger energetic resonance and a stronger energetic field than things that are from far, far away. That's just how it works. It's kind of like when you get seasonal fruit, the stuff that has grown local seasonal is better than the stuff that has been frozen and shipped 4,000 miles on a truck. In the dead of winter, when there are no local seasonal things, the frozen stuff from the truck is just fine. But if you can get local seasonal glorious, why wouldn't you? Magic is the same. Sure, I can use the dried herb that has been shipped from the mountainside in Romania. I can absolutely do that. And, sometimes maybe there's a practitioner in some far-flung location making some very specific tincture or formula or thing and doing things absolutely correctly and, has some amazing energy. That's a special thing. And maybe it's worth the time, the expense, the shipping for some special one-off thing. Like the get a new job to get your dream job, the, help you to find your soulmate, help to break out of, a lifelong negative pattern. Do the whole Hobbit quest thing. Have at it. But for the get me to work on time and please let my car not break down until next Tuesday when I can take it to the shop, that's more of a use what you got. Magic is about making your life better. If you're spending all of your time and energy on some wild quest to get, making organic tincture of gold, is it really making your life better? I mean, maybe it is. I don't know you. But that's not how I want to spend my time. I want to actually live my life and hang out with my friends and pet my cat and read my book. Um, Giant, never-ending piles of books. Yeah. So that begs the question, how do you know what the resonances are for your local plants? Well, those same sources that gave you your traditional correspondences may or may not have your local flora and fauna in there. If they do, go with it. If they don't, you have a couple of choices. So I mentioned in the last lesson the book Los Remedios is a book particularly of like Southwest plants and their kind of indigenous medicinal magical correspondences. Depending on where you live, there might be a similar resource for your natural area. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a lot of like hiking guides and plant identification guides for people that are doing hiking and foraging and that kind of thing. We're very, very nature focused up here for good reason. Because, it's pretty. It's so pretty. Except when it rains 9 months out of the year. It's raining right now. But so there might be a local resource with, the specific things that are native to your area that are going to give you correspondences. If not, you can often look to local indigenous mythology. A lot of indigenous cultures, obviously depending on where you live, but a lot of indigenous cultures have mythology that talk about plant spirits. The hero will go out into the woods and speak to the trees and the rivers, and the spirits of the waters shall guide them, blah, blah, blah. There's hints to correspondences in those myths. If you're really lucky, you might have a bunch of local practitioners that have actually worked up guides for your local area and what kind of correspondences you've got. If not, that's when you have to do your homework. You need to go out, look at plants, do some research, and then feel. All those energy checks we were talking about back in the metaphysical hygiene lesson, all the things you do to check your own personal energies, you can do to check the energies of a plant. And say, hey, plant, you're awesome. I would like to use you in magic. Would you be willing to help me? And if so, how would you like to help me with things? There's a whole field of kind of magic and medicine called plant spirit medicine. And that's all about communing with the spirits of the plants to determine how they wish you to use them. Back when we were in the last lesson looking at all those like 8 million different correspondences for a single plant, that's when a bunch of different people have gone to a plant, spoken to the plant's spirit, and had that plant spirit give them slightly different answers. Isn't it fun? So if I go and speak to the cedar tree that is right outside my front door, it is probably willing to help me with more than it might help some guest who's only here for a day. I've got a relationship with this plant. I water this plant. I care for this plant. I make sure it doesn't get infested with pests. My guest, less so. So the cedar might be willing to help me with cleansing and prosperity and blessings and healings and happiness and prosperity. But my guess, it might just be, I'll help give you a good cleansing from negative energies. But that's all I'm willing to do for you. That's how we get these, that's why lavender has 900 things under it, is over the years, many, many different practitioners have communed with lavender and gotten different answers. And so over the years, the correspondence has just become this vast 6-page thing. That's how that works. Quick note about indigenous plants, specifically things that are sacred to local indigenous peoples. There was a very fine line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. This is something that I'm going to bring up over and over again because we need to be extremely mindful of it. There is nothing wrong with appreciating indigenous mythos and using the correspondences of local tribes, local indigenous peoples for their plants, as long as the plant spirit doesn't like tell you to not do that. Always be respectful, always ask permission. We'll talk more about herbal magic and working with plants when we get into spell casting. Um, but for now, just understand that indigenous beliefs have a vast, vast context that is incredibly sacred to those indigenous peoples. If you do not know the context, if you don't know the myths, if you don't know how they're treated, if you don't know all of these different interweavings energetically, you know, part of the idea of, if you're not an indigenous person, don't burn white sage. Not only is it endangered, but it's a sacred medicine to the tribes that use that. And when you buy a smudge stick at, Sephora, it it smacks of blasphemy to a lot of indigenous people. And if you don't have to do that, why would you choose to? Maybe just me. Don't do that. Don't do that. So if in your research you're looking at local correspondence and you find some amazing myth about the sacredness of a particular plant, maybe check and make sure that that's something that your local tribes have not said, please leave that plant alone. A lot of indigenous folks have a belief that the plants and the animals around us are family. And if you're not doing the proper ceremonies and permissions and engaging in a particular context, it's incredibly hurtful to them. So be super careful. When in doubt, use the stuff that's like at the bus stop or in your yard. I do almost all of my herbal work with things that are kitchen herbs. If I'm allowed to put them in stew, I'm allowed to use them in magic. No one has ever told me, oh, you can't eat, gumbo. It's food. We all eat food. Maybe someone will come after me for that. I don't know. But when in doubt, if you can eat it, and you do eat it, you're probably going to be okay. But yeah, so local things have power and resonance and energy that things that are from far away just don't. So when in doubt, first thing, stuff that grows near you, wild and abundant, so you're not going to endanger the plant. Then, what have you got in your kitchen? That brings us to my favorite, which is personal correspondences. Now, as we live our lives, we have a lot of different things that have meaning for us, special meaning. One of my favorite movies is The Princess Bride, because that tells you a lot about how I grew up, when I grew up. But, all of the lines from that movie are those very quippy quotes of, oh, you keep using that word. That doesn't mean what you think that means, and never get involved in land war in Asia. And of course, hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. It was the first Hispanic person I ever saw on television. It was very meaningful to me as a small child. At least character-wise. Mandy Patinkin is not Hispanic. But anywho, things that have really important personal meaning to you are things you can use in your magic with that meaning that is special to you. What has more power than things that have great personal meaning to you? All of my students know this story. So if you're one of my students, you're watching this, you've heard this before. When I was in first grade, I had my tonsils out. And my dad bought me a plush Puff the Magic Dragon. And I loved that thing so hard. And it was my constant companion anytime I got sick. And then as I grew up, this stuffed Puff the Magic Dragon became the family hospital totem. Literally, anytime anyone in our family went into the hospital, whoever had had it last brought it to the hospital, and the Puff the Magic Dragon stayed with them until they were better. And then they brought it to the hospital for the next person who had to go in. And so over the years, this dragon has seen probably a dozen different relatives in different hospital stays. It has seen births, it has seen deaths, it has seen healing and everything you can imagine. So if I'm going to do a healing spell, I'm going to call on Puff the Magic Dragon because that is something that has more meaning for me in healing than any, healing god I could call on because I don't regularly work with a lot of healing deities. But I have this entire family context for Puff the Magic Dragon. Another totally weird personal thing for me, uh, when my husband and I got together, we were both 17. We were very, very nerdy and utterly unable to communicate to members of the opposite sex. Didn't. We're very nerdy. Very, very nerdy. Poor social skills. And we kind of got together by him lending me Metallica albums. And then we had an excuse to talk to each other because I would have to give back one and then get the next one. And that went back and forth for a really shockingly long time until we finally got together. So Metallica's Black Album is something I might use in a love spell. Maybe not something that would have that meaning for anybody else, but if I wanted to help two people get together, I would use Metallica, because that's how I landed my nerd boy. Um, called on that character for help. I have kind of a pop culture pantheon. Um, my healer is Doctor Who, specifically the 10th Doctor. Um, when I'm working on any kind of coding task on my computer, I'll call on Tony Stark. Um, when I feel like I need to cut a bitch, I will call on the Supreme, from American Horror Story, Fiona. We all have pop culture characters, movies, quotes, specific times and places in our lives that have vast, vast, deep meaning to us. My husband's family goes to Priest Lake, Idaho for a family vacation every year for like 5 generations. It is literally sacred space to them. Um, Having a bit of Mount Rainier for me, if I want to do a grounding spell, I'm going to get some dirt from Mount Rainier to do it. If I'm going to cleanse, I'm going to get water from Puget Sound because that's where I live and it has meaning for me. I grew up going to the Marina Beach in Edmonds. Use the things that have meaning for you. Where did you go to school? Where did you go to a summer camp that was just the best place in the world? Are you a Disney family that goes to Disneyland every year? There can be dirt in Disneyland you can put in a baggie. Um, Carefully, mindfully. Um, you know, you can have all of these wonderful things that are around us that have so much personal meaning. You know, when I have a cold, I make my mom's chicken soup. That's it's a very plain recipe, but it is magical because every time I've been sick since I was knee high to a grapefruit, I have had this chicken soup or some small variation thereof. You know, all of these things have magic and they have resonance, and they have meaning, and why would you not use the things that mean something to you? It might feel a little bit silly at first. Feeling like a valid practitioner is one of the biggest hurdles to doing effective magic. So many beginning practitioners just, oh, I can't do that. That would be ridiculous. Oh, I feel silly if I do this. You know, I can't spin around 3 times and do the hokey pokey. Eh, silly, yes, but gosh, it can work. Um, I once went to, you know, a spiritual retreat kind of thing, and when we closed down the retreat, we literally sang "I'm a Little Teapot" to kind of dispel any lingering energies we had brought to the space to make it neutral again. It was incredibly effective. Was it ridiculous? Yes, yes, it was. "I'm a Little Teapot" is always ridiculous, even when you're 6. Um, that doesn't mean it's not okay. Use what you've got. Use the things that already have meaning for you. You don't need to have this amazing uphill climb to begin to attach meaning to things that don't work for you. I mean, yes, if you're going to work in community, those common correspondences and traditional correspondence are kind of our common language for how to think about this sort of thing. So you do have to know it. And you can tell a lot about somebody by what correspondences they use. You can tell who trained them, how they were trained, what sources they've read, what traditions, by how they use their correspondences. Are they mishmashing a bunch of things? Do they even know they're doing it? I will admit, I sometimes judge people on their correspondences. Not by it being correct or not, but by whether they understand what they're doing with it. Like I said, correspondences can be incredibly, incredibly personal. What works for you for a certain symbol might not work for somebody else, and vice versa. Why shoehorn yourself into something that doesn't work for you when there's a million other things that are much better for you? Once again, we're going from point A to point B. There are many ways to get there. Don't lock yourself into one particular way. One of the kind of raison d'etre of this whole program for me is that I don't want you to learn how to do things the way I do them. I want you to figure out what it looks like for you to do things. I want you to figure out what your path needs to look like, not what anybody else says it should look like. It's got to work for you. It's your magic. And honestly, a lot of the time, no one else is going to know. So who cares if you feel a little bit ridiculous? You know, if it feels good, if it resonates, if it works for you, if it gets you the results, who cares what anybody else thinks? This is your magic. This is your power. Seize it, use it. Don't let anybody else tell you that you can't. As long as you are safe and others are safe. That is the only real caveat. You know, do whatever you need to do if it's actually making your life and the world a better place. If it's making your life fall apart, or if it's hurting others, be they plant, animal, or person, or spirit, you know, don't enslave spirits. That's not cool. We're all in this to make things better. If you are making things better, fuck what anybody else says. Keep doing it. With that, your post-lesson tasks. Take that table of correspondences that you started in the last lesson. and add on 1 to 2 personal correspondences for the big kind of categories of things. Things like health and healing, wealth and fertility, love, communication, cleansing, psychic power, justice, blessings, protection. I had a I have a friend who, when she was a little girl, whenever she was scared and couldn't sleep, she would envision this huge, glowing Aslan type lion that would just like lay on her and keep all the bad monsters away and all the nightmares. And so for her, the lion is the most protective thing possible. Um, find the things that have meaning for you. Maybe you don't have some, big grand story. Maybe you just have like a gut instinct. Or, maybe it's a video game character, or your D&D paladin has some cool shield. It doesn't have to be some huge grandiose thing. It can be anything that has meaning for you. So go through, add some personal correspondences to the big categories of things. For each of the things that you add, take some time to really think about why you've chosen it. Maybe you're not really sure. Maybe you're going to change this later. That's okay. This is not some permanent, sacred grimoire of doom. This is probably a spreadsheet or page in a notebook. Start with what pops into your head and refine it later as you start doing your practices and figure out what works for you. You don't have to know everything right now. You're probably not going to. Don't stress. And then go through for kind of 3 different of the big traditional categories and choose 1 traditional component and 1 personal component for each of those kind of meetings, and think about how you feel about them. Which, maybe they both resonate for you. Maybe one does and one doesn't. Think about what those different things actually mean for you. If you're going to do, say, a protection spell, and you have, the traditional correspondence is like bloodstone and dragon's blood incense and Aries. And maybe your personal correspondence is like Buffy the Vampire Slayer's stake, Mr. Pointy, that she got from Kendra. Maybe it's Captain America's shield and a white horse of Valdemar from the Mercedes Lackey books. In a given spell, you really only need a couple of correspondences, so think about what you might use and why and how. If you've got something that's super resonant but doesn't really work for a spell method, like how would you work a spirit horse from Valdemar into a candle spell? I'm sure it can be done, but it might be easier if you got like a stuffed white horse. You can use toys and stuffed animals in Magic. Yes, you can. And I do often. I have a lot of action figures. So, think about what you would use, in a practical sense. What things are easiest to kind of put into your magic. So a lot of times I'll go with those traditional correspondences because I have a bunch of herbs, because I have a bunch of stones. But the spirit I might call to help me energize those things might be one of my pop culture folks, might be one of my personal kind of references. There's no rule saying you cannot combine things. It's all about what works for you. So, yeah, that's correspondences. I hope this kind of gave you some more options for how to think about correspondences and what you can do to enhance your magic. In our next lesson, we're going to start getting into actual spellcasting. It's going to be a lot of fun. I hope to see you soon. Bye.